If you're so smart, translate it. Millionaire lawyer, ridiculed janitor, then was stunned into silence. Hey there, and welcome back to the Stories TH channel. Today, we've got a story that'll not only inspire you, but maybe make you rethink what's possible. It's about a person who went from zero to millionaire against all odds. Sounds exciting, right? But before you get too excited, fair warning, this story might just challenge everything you thought you knew about success. If you're new here, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to Stories TH, because you won't want to miss out on these incredible stories. Also, I'd love to know, where are you watching from, and what time is it in your part of the world? Drop your location and time in the comments below. All right, get comfy and relax, because we're about to dive into an inspiring journey that'll keep you hooked till the end. Let's get started. The bright lights of Manhattan, the 42nd floor of Houghton Langford LLP, glistened like a jewel under the sprawling skyline of Manhattan. The night had fallen, yet the lights from the city below reflected off the massive glass windows, creating a dazzling contrast to the silence that enveloped the office. The hum of the city, the clink of wine glasses, and the faint buzz of voices from the conference room were like background music to the world of luxury that Ellie Parker could only dream of. Ellie, in her worn gray uniform, pushed her cleaning cart down the marble hallway, the soft squeak of the wheels echoing in the otherwise quiet space. It was well past midnight, and the office was nearly empty, except for a few employees finishing up late-night tasks. Her eyes, a deep brown with the spark of determination, drifted to the conference room where a meeting was taking place. She knew the people inside were discussing multi-million-dollar deals, the kinds of discussions that she would never be invited to. Ellie didn't mind. She wasn't here to be a part of that world, at least not yet. She paused, just for a moment, to listen. It wasn't curiosity, but a deep longing to feel connected to something bigger, something better than the life she had been handed. She had grown up in the slums of Queens, a place where dreams were seldom realized, and the future often seemed as dull as the gray streets that lined it. But Ellie had always been different. She wanted more. She needed more. She pulled a small, well-worn law book from her bag, Droid International, the title, printed in bold letters on the cover. Her grandmother, who had come from Haiti, had first introduced her to the idea of learning French when Ellie was just 15 years old. Now, at 25, she was teaching herself legal French, practicing the terms, reading through the pages like they were sacred. Tonight, as she stood quietly in the corridor, she wasn't just a janitor mopping the floors. She was a future lawyer in the making, waiting for the right opportunity to prove that she was worth more than her circumstances. She whispered the legal terms under her breath, her heart beating a little faster with each word she read. She could feel it, the knowledge, the power, the future she was building for herself. One day, she knew, these late nights, these moments of solitude would pay off. But for now, they were all she had. The door to the conference room swung open, cutting her thoughts short. She quickly tucked her book back into her bag, her heartbeat quickening, though she wasn't sure why. A tall man stepped out, sharply dressed in a navy blue suit, his dark hair combed neatly. It was Alexander Hunt, CEO of Houghton Langford LLP. A man whose reputation in the legal world was legendary, a genius, but also known for his cold, ruthless demeanor. His piercing blue eyes scanned the hallway before landing on Ellie. They briefly met her gaze, then flicked to the book on the floor, which had fallen when she tried to quickly hide it. His voice, sharp and laced with mockery, echoed in the hallway. "What are you doing?" he asked, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "Sneaking a peek at company documents during your shift?" Ellie's pulse raced, but she remained composed. "No, sir," she said, picking up the book with a steady hand. "This is my book. I was reading." But Alexander wasn't convinced. His eyebrow arched as he leaned in closer, his gaze calculating. "You, a janitor, reading international law in French?" He let out a laugh, devoid of warmth. "Seriously?" Ellie stood tall, her pride stung but unbroken. "I read because I want to learn," she replied, her voice calm but firm. Alexander's smirk remained as he crossed his arms, intrigued. "Learn for what? To mop floors more efficiently?" Ellie met his gaze, her eyes unwavering. She wasn't just a janitor. Not anymore. The unexpected encounter. Ellie's heart skipped a beat as Alexander's gaze lingered on her, his amusement only adding to the pressure of the moment. She wasn't sure why she felt so exposed, perhaps because she had always kept her dreams hidden, buried beneath the layers of her daily life. But this moment was different. There was something about Alexander's piercing blue eyes that made her feel as though he could see right through her, stripping away her carefully guarded facade. He looked at her, as if sizing her up, and then, with a dismissive wave of his hand, he gestured to the open conference room door behind him. "If you're so interested in legal matters, then come inside," he said, his tone still tinged with mockery, but there was an underlying challenge in his words. "Let's see if you really know your stuff." Ellie's instincts screamed at her to turn and walk away. She didn't belong in that room. She was a janitor, nothing more. But something inside her, something defiant, something fueled by years of quiet rejection, urged her to step forward. She wasn't going to let him see her cower. Taking a deep breath, Ellie followed Alexander inside, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched the book to her chest. As she entered, the air in the room seemed to thicken, heavy with the scent of expensive cologne and the murmur of the lawyers sitting around the long mahogany table. The walls were lined with bookshelves filled with legal tomes, but none of them felt as important as the one she held in her hands. The 7 lawyers inside were dressed in designer suits, their voices a mix of professional jargon and laughter as they debated the finer details of a contract. The atmosphere felt worlds away from the quiet halls she was used to cleaning, and Ellie could hardly suppress a wave of nervousness. But she didn't flinch. She stood there, awkwardly, at the threshold of a world she had always dreamed of entering, but never had the chance. Alexander stepped forward, his eyes scanning the room, and then, as if to make a point, he held up a hand. The chatter ceased instantly. "Everyone," he began, his voice dripping with sarcasm, "we have an unexpected guest tonight. This girl claims she reads law in French." He turned to Ellie with a mocking smile. "Well then, let's see how well you know it." Without waiting for a response, he picked up a thick contract from the table and tossed it at Ellie. The paper fluttered through the air, landing with a soft thud in her hands. The room fell silent as everyone watched her, some with curiosity, others with outright amusement. Ellie's grip tightened around the contract. The room seemed to close in on her, but she didn't let the pressure show. She scanned the page, her eyes quickly moving over the dense, legal text written in fine print. The language was familiar to her, the phrases and clauses as clear as any passage she had read in her textbooks. Her pulse quickened as she began to read, her voice steady and precise. Clause 14.2. The party agrees to transfer control of the assets within 90 days of signing, provided that Party B completes full payment before the due date. She paused for a moment, her eyes narrowing as she studied the next section. Something didn't seem right. As she continued, her voice grew more confident, more sure of herself. "But there's a mistake here," she said, looking up from the contract to meet Alexander's eyes directly. "The English version of this clause mistranslates a critical detail. It says if Party B fails to pay on time, Party A has the right to reclaim the assets. But the original French version also includes a penalty clause, a 20% charge for late payment. If you sign this, your firm could lose millions." Ellie's words hung in the air, and the room fell into stunned silence. The lawyers exchanged uneasy glances as one of them, Mr. Grayson, quickly snatched the contract from Ellie's hands. He flipped through the pages, his face paling as he realized she was right. Alexander stood frozen, his gaze on Ellie no longer filled with mockery, but shock and frustration. He couldn't admit it, not to himself, not to anyone, but a janitor had just exposed a critical flaw his entire legal team had missed. "You," Alexander began, his voice cold, but with a tinge of something else, something like respect, though he refused to acknowledge it, "are impressive." Ellie didn't flinch at his words. She simply stood there, feeling the weight of her own quiet triumph, the satisfaction of knowing that despite the doubts, despite the mockery, she had proved them wrong. But before she could leave, Alexander's voice cut through the silence. "But don't think you can walk in here and act superior. Get back to mopping, girl." Ellie didn't say a word. She turned on her heel and walked out of the conference room, her heart pounding not with anger, but with the steady beat of a new, unshakable confidence. For the first time, she wasn't just someone cleaning the floors. She was someone who had just saved the day. A bitter challenge. The hallway felt different as Ellie made her way back to the janitor's closet. The echo of her footsteps, once so familiar, now seemed distant, like she was walking through someone else's life. Her heart was still racing, but it wasn't fear that had her pulse quickening anymore. It was something else. Something she couldn't quite put into words. Her mind replayed the look on Alexander's face when she had exposed the error in the contract. The flicker of surprise in his eyes had been brief, but it was enough. For the first time, he had seen her not as a janitor, not as the invisible worker in the corner of the office, but as someone capable, someone valuable. But as soon as that respect had surfaced, he had buried it with his harsh words. "Get back to mopping, girl." His voice still echoed in her mind. Ellie had expected the mockery, but it still stung. She pushed open the door to the janitor's closet and grabbed her cleaning supplies. The smell of bleach and floor polish filled the air, an oddly comforting scent in the sterile room. She stood still for a moment, steadying herself. But the bitterness lingered. She wasn't stupid. She knew that her role in the firm was always going to be limited, no matter how much knowledge she gained or how many mistakes she caught. She was a janitor, nothing more. But that didn't mean she couldn't make a difference. Later that night, as Ellie scrubbed the floors of the conference room, her thoughts swirled around the events from earlier. She had felt something shift inside her when she spoke up, when she corrected that mistake. It wasn't just about the translation or the legal jargon. It was about something deeper. It was about the injustice of being overlooked, being dismissed, simply because of her position. And now, having stood in that room and spoken up, she realized something. She didn't have to let them define her. She could define herself. The next morning, as Ellie returned to the 42nd floor to continue her shift, she caught sight of Alexander again. He was in the lobby, his navy suit impeccable as always, surrounded by a group of lawyers, all hanging on his every word. As he spoke, his icy blue eyes swept over the room, but for just a moment, they lingered on Ellie. For a brief second, the arrogance and coldness seemed to melt away. He didn't say anything, didn't even acknowledge her, but in that fleeting glance, Ellie saw something. The tiniest flicker of recognition, and for the first time, she wasn't sure if it was pity or respect. She wasn't sure if she cared anymore. Ellie went about her work, the weight of the day heavy on her shoulders. She could feel the eyes of the staff on her, could feel the judgment in the air. But she held her head high. She had done something no one expected. She had stood her ground, and that was only the beginning. The hidden genius. As the days passed, Ellie's life seemed to settle back into its predictable rhythm until one fateful afternoon when everything changed. It started with a strange feeling that she couldn't shake, a nagging sensation that someone was watching her, always just out of sight. She tried to brush it off, telling herself she was imagining things, but deep down, she knew something was different. It was late in the afternoon when Alexander Hunt's assistant approached her as she was finishing up in the break room. "Miss Parker?" the assistant called, her voice polite but businesslike. "Mr. Hunt has requested your presence in his office." Ellie froze. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't done anything wrong, at least, nothing that would warrant the CEO's attention. Hesitantly, she pushed the cleaning cart toward the elevator. Her mind raced with a dozen possibilities, none of them pleasant. What could he possibly want with her? When the elevator doors opened on the 42nd floor, Ellie stepped out, her heart pounding in her chest. The sleek, modern hallway stretched out before her, the same hall she had walked 1,000 times. But today it felt unfamiliar, almost imposing. As she approached Alexander's office, she could hear the low hum of voices and the occasional clink of a glass. The assistant led her inside, and as Ellie stepped into the expansive office, Alexander looked up from his desk, his icy blue eyes meeting hers. For a moment, she thought she saw something like respect in his gaze, something she had never expected from him. "Miss Parker," he said, his voice calm but with an edge of something she couldn't quite place. "Have a seat." Ellie did as she was told, but the discomfort in her chest didn't fade. Alexander leaned back in his chair, folding his arms across his chest, and studied her for a moment. "I've been reviewing some things," he began, his voice steady, but Ellie could hear the faint hint of intrigue in it. "Your performance has caught my attention, and I've learned a few things about you. You're quite the self-starter." Ellie didn't know how to respond. She was used to being invisible, to working in the shadows, but hearing those words from him, especially after everything that had happened, felt surreal. "You've taught yourself law," Alexander continued, his voice softer now. "And despite what people might think of your position here, I see a lot of potential in you." Ellie couldn't help it. She felt a spark of hope. It was tiny, but it was there. He wasn't mocking her anymore. He was acknowledging her, for the first time, as someone capable, someone with value. "I'm offering you a chance," he said, leaning forward slightly, his gaze intense. "A chance to prove yourself." Ellie's pulse quickened. This was the moment she had been waiting for. But what was the catch? "What kind of chance?" she asked, her voice steady despite the excitement bubbling beneath the surface. Alexander stood, walking over to the window and looking out over the city. He turned back to face her, a flicker of something complicated in his expression. "I want you to join the firm's new legal fellowship program. It's not much, at least, not yet, but it's a step, a real one." Ellie couldn't believe it. The offer felt too big, too impossible to be real. But here it was, right in front of her. She swallowed hard, her throat dry. "And why me?" she asked, genuinely curious. Alexander's eyes softened for the briefest moment. "Because you've shown me more than most of these people ever will. You have more to offer than anyone here knows. This isn't just a chance for you to prove something to them, it's a chance for you to prove something to yourself." Ellie's mind raced. This was the break she had been dreaming of, the one she had been working toward for years. But there was still a part of her, an old part of her, that wanted to turn it down, to keep her distance, to keep her pride intact. But then she thought of her mother, of the long nights spent studying, of every rejection letter that had built up in a pile of forgotten dreams. She thought of everything she had sacrificed, everything she had worked for, and suddenly, there was no choice. "I accept," she said, her voice firm and unwavering. "I'll prove that I belong." For the first time in a long while, Ellie felt something shift inside her. This wasn't just a chance to step into the world of law. It was a chance to step into the world she had always belonged to, the world that had always felt just out of reach. And she was ready. The price of ambition. The days that followed felt like a blur to Ellie. She immersed herself in the legal fellowship program with everything she had, diving deep into case law, contracts, and precedents, just as she had done when she taught herself French. But this time, it was different. This time, she wasn't reading alone in the quiet corners of the office or in the solitude of her cramped apartment. This time, she had a seat at the table. Her classmates, law school graduates with Ivy League degrees, looked at her with a mix of skepticism and curiosity. Ellie didn't mind. She had worked too hard to let their stares rattle her. She had come here to prove her worth, not to fit into their expectations. Every time she spoke in the seminar, her voice steady, her arguments sharp, she could see them reassessing their first impressions. They were starting to notice her, starting to see the quiet strength in her that she had carried for so long. But while Ellie found herself slowly earning the respect of her peers, she couldn't shake the feeling that something else was at play. Alexander Hunt's attention had shifted, but not in the way she had imagined. Every time they worked together on a case, she could feel the weight of his gaze, the subtle flicker of admiration in his eyes. He was not just watching her as a colleague. There was something more there, something unspoken. And that's what made her uneasy. Ellie wasn't the type of person to rely on anyone. She had learned long ago to fend for herself, to fight for what she wanted without anyone's help. But Alexander's presence, his unwavering support of her, his belief in her, it confused her. She wasn't sure if she could trust it, or if she even wanted to. One late evening, As Ellie worked on an urgent case in her office, she found herself once again thinking about the past. Her mother, still fighting a losing battle against her illness, had never known the life Ellie was beginning to carve out for herself. Ellie had always kept her dreams close to her heart, far from the struggles they both faced. But now, with this opportunity, with Alexander's offer to help fund her mother's treatments, Ellie felt conflicted. She had already turned down his charity once, and that rejection still weighed on her. She wasn't ready to accept help, not yet, not from him. It wasn't pride, at least not entirely. It was about proving something to herself, about standing on her own 2 feet without anyone's pity. Her phone buzzed on the desk. She glanced down at the screen. It was an email from Alexander's assistant, confirming a meeting the next day with the board to review her progress. A strange knot tightened in her stomach as she read the words. It wasn't just a professional meeting. The language in the email suggested something more, something personal, something that made her heart beat a little faster. Ellie wasn't sure what to expect from tomorrow's meeting, but one thing was clear. Everything was about to change. The question was whether she was ready for it. A moment of vulnerability. The day of the board meeting arrived, and Ellie found herself pacing in front of her desk. She had reviewed every detail of her case, prepared every argument she could anticipate, and still, a strange unease gnawed at her. The familiarity of the law, the sense of control she had always held over her studies, was now overshadowed by the uncertainty of what would happen next. This wasn't just another case. This was a test not just of her legal mind, but of her worth, her place in this world that felt so far removed from everything she had known. As she entered the boardroom, the sharp scent of expensive cologne mixed with the faint hum of conversation. The room was filled with the usual faces, lawyers in tailored suits, their eyes skimming over their documents, glancing up with barely concealed judgment. Alexander was already seated at the head of the table, his usual confidence emanating from him. But there was something different today. His gaze lingered on her as she walked in, a subtle flicker of something unspoken in his eyes. "Ellie," he said, his voice calm, yet there was a warmth there that caught her off guard. "Thank you for coming. Please, have a seat." Ellie sat down, her back straight, trying to push aside the nervous energy that buzzed through her veins. The board members around the table shifted in their seats, exchanging glances. They were waiting for her to speak. The weight of their attention felt heavier than any case she had ever worked on, but she wasn't about to let it break her. Not now. She cleared her throat and began, outlining the details of the case she had been working on. As she spoke, her mind raced, focusing on the contract clause she had meticulously studied. The confidence she had been building in the fellowship program over the past week seemed to surge through her. Her voice steadied, her words growing sharper, more precise. Then, as she wrapped up her presentation, she caught Alexander's eyes again. There was something vulnerable in them now, something softer than the usual ice-cold demeanor he wore. Ellie wasn't sure if it was admiration or something else entirely, but it made her heart beat a little faster. Just as the room began to murmur, one of the senior attorneys, Grayson, interrupted her. "This is all very impressive, Miss Parker," he said with a sneer. "But let's not forget your position here. You're still a janitor, not a lawyer. You don't have the credentials to be advising us on these matters." The words stung, but Ellie wasn't about to let them knock her off course. She met Grayson's gaze head-on, her voice calm but resolute. "I may not have the credentials you think I should have, Mr. Grayson," she said, "but I've spent every day earning my place here. And I'm not here by mistake. I'm here because I belong." A tense silence fell over the room. Even Alexander's usual stoicism cracked slightly as he shifted in his seat, his eyes flicking between Ellie and the board members. It was clear that something had changed. The respect he had for her wasn't just professional anymore, it was personal. He had been watching her, not just as an employee, but as someone who had earned every inch of her seat at this table. And in that moment, Ellie realized something. This wasn't just about her proving herself to them. It was about her proving something to herself. She wasn't just a janitor, a dreamer from the slums of Queens. She was a force in her own right, and she wasn't going to let anyone take that away from her. The tipping point. The rest of the board meeting passed in a blur for Ellie. She could still feel the weight of Grayson's words pressing down on her, but she had fought back. She had stood her ground, and for the first time, she saw the other lawyers in the room falter. Even Grayson, the arrogant senior partner, hesitated as if unsure of himself for a split second. By the time the meeting concluded, Ellie's mind was racing. She had proven herself, at least for now, but the tension in the room lingered. As she gathered her notes, she could feel Alexander's gaze on her once more. He said nothing as the others filed out, but there was an intensity in his eyes, a quiet acknowledgement that hadn't been there before. It wasn't just respect this time. It was something deeper, something unspoken. She left the boardroom, her heart pounding in her chest. For the first time since joining the fellowship, she felt the sting of being both an outsider and an insider. She had earned her place, at least professionally, but emotionally, she wasn't sure. She wasn't sure she could trust anyone in this world, especially not someone like Alexander Hunt. That night, as Ellie sat at her desk working late, her phone buzzed. It was a message from Alexander's assistant asking her to meet with him in his office first thing the next morning. Ellie felt a mix of anxiety and curiosity. What did he want now? The offer of the fellowship had been unexpected enough, but this felt like something else. A part of her wanted to decline, to stay focused on her work and avoid whatever conversation was looming. But another part of her, the part that was determined to rise above everything, knew she had to face this head on. The next morning, she arrived at Alexander's office, her heart pounding. She tried to steady her breath as she entered, finding him sitting at his desk, looking more serious than she had ever seen him. There was no humor in his posture, no smugness in his expression. He looked, for the first time, uncertain. "Ellie," he began, his voice steady but laced with a hint of vulnerability. "I need to talk to you about something important." Ellie's stomach twisted. Was this the moment when everything would crumble? Would he finally admit that the fellowship program was a mistake, that she didn't belong here after all? He gestured for her to sit. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened in the meeting yesterday," he said, "and I want to apologize for what I said before, for underestimating you." Ellie blinked, taken aback. The apology didn't come with a hint of superiority or pity. It was real. "You don't need to apologize," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the warmth that spread through her chest. "I didn't do it for you. I did it for me." Alexander's eyes softened, and for the first time, Ellie saw him not as the cold, distant CEO, but as someone who had been deeply moved by her strength. "I know," he said, his voice quiet. "But still, you deserve more than just my acknowledgement. I want to make things right." He paused, then continued, his words more deliberate now. "I've spoken to the board, and I'm pushing for something bigger for you." Ellie's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" "I'm starting a new initiative at the firm," he said. "A program that will help those who don't have traditional backgrounds, who don't fit the mold. And I want you to be part of it, not just as a participant, but as a leader." Ellie's mind raced. She had always dreamed of a chance like this, but she wasn't sure if she was ready for it. Would the board back her? Would they accept someone like her? Alexander leaned forward, his eyes locking onto hers. "I believe in you, Ellie, more than anyone here ever will. And I want you to prove to everyone, including yourself, that you belong here. Not because I'm giving you a handout, but because you've earned it. All of it." Ellie took a deep breath, the weight of his words settling in. She had fought her way to this point, but now it felt different. She wasn't just proving her worth to the firm or the board, she was proving it to herself. For the first time, Ellie felt like she could truly build the future she had always wanted, and with Alexander's offer, it felt like that future was within reach. The proposal of equals. The following days felt like a whirlwind to Ellie. As news of the new initiative spread through Hunt and Langford LLP, she found herself thrust into a new role, one she had never expected, but had worked for her entire life. She wasn't just part of the fellowship program anymore. She was helping shape it, designing a future for others like her people from backgrounds that weren't exactly up to standard in the eyes of the legal elite. Yet, despite her growing excitement, Ellie couldn't shake a feeling of hesitation. This wasn't just about proving herself to the firm anymore. It was about navigating a world where she had never truly belonged. Every time she walked through the marble hallways of the firm, every time she saw the board members discussing million-dollar contracts in the conference room, she was reminded of how far she still had to go. But there was something else now. Something that Ellie hadn't fully understood until recently. She wasn't just working for respect anymore. She was working for herself, for the future she had been dreaming about since she was a little girl. That evening, as Ellie worked late in the office, a knock on her door interrupted her concentration. She looked up to find Alexander standing in the doorway, holding a file in his hand. "Ellie," he said, his voice calm but with a hint of tension. "We need to talk." Ellie set her pen down and motioned for him to come in. There was something in his eyes, something more than the usual professional demeanor that made her nervous. She had come to respect Alexander, even admire him, but she wasn't sure where they stood anymore. After everything that had happened, the lines between professional and personal had become increasingly blurred. As he stepped into her office, Alexander closed the door behind him and sat down across from her. He didn't speak for a moment, his gaze focused on the file in his hands, and Ellie couldn't help but wonder what was going through his mind. "I've been thinking about everything that's happened between us," Alexander began, his voice quiet but firm. "The fellowship program, your position here at the firm, and about us." Ellie's heart skipped a beat. The last few weeks had been a whirlwind of emotions, but she hadn't expected this kind of conversation. She had been so focused on proving herself, on fighting for her place, that she hadn't stopped to think about what this might mean for her relationship with Alexander. "I'm not sure what you're trying to say," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady despite the growing anxiety in her chest. Alexander's eyes softened, and he leaned forward slightly, his expression vulnerable. "What I'm trying to say, Ellie, is that I respect you. I respect you more than anyone I've ever worked with, more than anyone I've ever known." He paused, as if gathering the courage to say something that had been weighing on him. "But I don't want you to think that I'm giving you this opportunity out of pity. I want you to know that you've earned everything that's coming your way. And I want you to be my equal in this firm, not because I'm offering you charity, but because you've proven that you belong." Ellie stared at him, her mind spinning. She wasn't sure what to say, or even if she could say anything. Alexander had just opened up to her in a way that no one ever had. He wasn't offering her pity or a handout. He was offering her a partnership, a chance to truly be his equal. And that was something Ellie had never expected. "I want you to be my partner," Alexander continued, his voice soft but resolute. "Not just in the firm, but in everything. I'm not offering you a place as a charity case. I'm offering you a chance to build something together. Equal partners." Ellie's heart raced as his words sank in. For the first time, she felt like she wasn't just a pawn in someone else's game. She wasn't just a janitor, a self-taught legal expert trying to prove her worth. She was someone who could stand beside Alexander, not beneath him. It was more than she had ever dreamed of. It was a future built on mutual respect, trust, and shared ambition. But as the words hung in the air between them, Ellie realized something else. She wasn't just working to prove herself anymore. She was working to build a future for herself and for those like her, who had been overlooked and underestimated their whole lives. "I'll accept," Ellie said, her voice firm but filled with emotion. "On one condition." Alexander raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "What's that?" "We build this together," she said, her gaze unwavering. "As equals. No one above, no one below." Alexander smiled. A genuine smile this time, free of sarcasm or hidden agendas. "Agreed. As equals." And in that moment, Ellie knew that this was just the beginning. A new chapter was waiting for her, and she wasn't going to walk it alone. The rumors resurface. Ellie's success in the legal fellowship program was undeniable. She was the first to stay late in the office, meticulously reviewing cases and contributing to discussions with insights that surprised even the most seasoned lawyers. Her confidence grew with each victory, each acknowledgement from her peers. but so did the whispers that followed her through the halls of Hunt and Langford, LLP. It wasn't just the fact that she had been promoted to such a high position without the right background, no Ivy League degree, no family connections. It was the way she had earned her place. The old guard, the senior partners who had spent their careers climbing the corporate ladder the traditional way, were uncomfortable with Ellie's rise. It didn't fit their narrative. Ellie couldn't escape the feeling that her every move was being watched. Every time she entered a room, she could sense the subtle glances, the hushed conversations, the way some people tried to avoid making eye contact. She was used to being an outsider, but this was different. This felt personal. And then, the rumors started. It began with a few offhand comments here and there. "She's only here because of Alexander," one of the junior associates had whispered to another. "There's no way she could have earned this on her own. She must be involved with him." The speculation quickly spread, gaining momentum, as whispers often do. Ellie tried to ignore it, to focus on the work she had fought so hard to earn, but it was impossible. No matter how successful she was, how much she proved herself, the rumors followed her like a shadow. It wasn't just the whispers behind closed doors anymore. It was the snide remarks in the elevator, the awkward silence when she walked past certain colleagues. One afternoon, Ellie found herself standing in the break room, trying to ignore the tension as she made her coffee. She had just wrapped up an important presentation with Alexander, impressing the board with her legal analysis and proposed amendments. It had been a huge success, but the praise was still fresh in her ears when she overheard a conversation between two senior partners near the coffee machine. "I don't know how she sleeps at night," one of them said, his voice low but audible. "Getting everything handed to her because of some connection with the CEO. She doesn't even deserve to be here." Ellie's hand tightened around her coffee cup. The words stung, but they weren't new. She had faced criticism all her life growing up in the projects, working menial jobs just to survive. But it was different here. In this world she had fought so hard to enter. The voices were louder. The stakes were higher. What bothered Ellie the most, however, wasn't the rumors themselves, it was the way they made her feel. Despite everything she had accomplished, she couldn't escape the nagging doubt that maybe they were right. Maybe the only reason she was here was because of Alexander, because of his belief in her, his help, his support. But she quickly pushed the thought away. She wasn't here because of pity or a handout. She was here because she had earned it. No one, least of all them, could take that away from her. Determined to remain unshaken, Ellie stood taller. She couldn't let their words define her, couldn't let their doubts stop her from moving forward. She had come too far to turn back now. As she walked out of the break room, she caught Alexander's gaze from across the hallway. He offered her a silent nod, a brief moment of acknowledgement that only the two of them understood. And in that instant, Ellie knew. She didn't need to prove anything to anyone else. She was already where she was meant to be. The tipping point. The next few weeks were a blur of long hours, tense meetings, and constant pressure. Despite Ellie's growing success in the legal fellowship, the rumors surrounding her never fully dissipated. Every time she walked into the office, it felt like the weight of the firm's skepticism was pressing down on her. But Ellie refused to let it break her. She had worked too hard, come too far, and she knew, deep down, that she wasn't just a janitor playing dress-up in a lawyer's suit. She belonged here. But then, something unexpected happened. It started with a routine meeting in the conference room. Alexander had asked Ellie to present a new case to a few key partners, a presentation she had been preparing for weeks. As she spoke, her voice steady and confident, she noticed a few of the senior partners exchanging glances. Their eyes filled with barely masked disdain. She couldn't ignore it. She felt the old doubts creeping in, like shadows pulling at her resolve. It wasn't until the end of the meeting, when Alexander stood to address the group, that Ellie began to sense something was different. "I've been watching Ellie's work over the past few months," Alexander said, his voice calm but unwavering. "And I can tell you one thing for sure, her insight, her legal acumen, her commitment to this firm is unmatched. We wouldn't be where we are today without her." Ellie's heart skipped a beat at his words. The recognition she had fought so hard for, the acknowledgement she had longed for, was finally here. But it wasn't just professional. It was personal. For the first time, Ellie felt like she wasn't just a token employee, a symbol of Alexander's support. She was valued for what she brought to the table, for her intelligence, her skill, and her drive. But just as Ellie began to bask in the weight of his praise, the room shifted. One of the senior partners, Grayson, stood up, his face flushed with anger. "Alexander," he said, his voice dripping with contempt. "We appreciate your enthusiasm, but let's not get carried away. We all know that Ellie's rise here has more to do with her connection to you than her qualifications. She's still just a janitor." The words hit Ellie like a punch to the gut. Her body stiffened, and she could feel the blood rush to her face. The room fell silent as all eyes turned to her. It was as if the air had been sucked out of the room. She was used to being looked down on, to being dismissed, but this was different. This was in front of the people who had become her peers, in front of the firm's leaders. For a moment, Ellie couldn't breathe. The doubts, the fears she had pushed away for so long came crashing back. She wanted to run. She wanted to escape the suffocating weight of their judgment. But as she took a deep breath, she realized something. She had fought too long and too hard to let these people define her. She wasn't going to let Grayson or anyone else strip away what she had built. Ellie stood up slowly, her hands gripping the edge of the table as she met Grayson's gaze. "You're right," she said, her voice steady, her words sharp. "I'm not here because of my qualifications. I'm here because I've earned it. I've worked harder than any of you know to get to this point. And no matter what you think of me, I'm not going anywhere." The room was silent for a long beat, and for the first time, Ellie felt a flicker of something: respect? Fear? In the eyes of the senior partners. Grayson's face twisted into a scowl, but he said nothing more. Alexander, who had been watching the entire exchange in silence, nodded slightly, his expression unreadable. For the first time, Ellie saw him not as the CEO, not as her boss, but as someone who saw her for what she was, a woman who refused to back down, no matter the odds. As the meeting ended, Ellie walked out of the conference room with her head held high. She didn't need their approval anymore. She had Alexander's support, but more importantly, she had her own. For the first time, she felt truly unstoppable. A new beginning. After the tense meeting with Grayson, the atmosphere at Hunt & Langford LLP shifted. It wasn't an immediate change, but Ellie could feel it. She no longer walked through the halls feeling the weight of whispered judgment or the subtle sneers of her colleagues. It wasn't that the rumors had stopped, they hadn't, but something had changed in the air, a quiet respect beginning to take root. The senior partners no longer looked through her as if she were invisible. They no longer dismissed her as just another janitor. They saw her now Ellie Parker, a force in her own right. And with that shift, something deep inside Ellie clicked. She wasn't just proving herself to the firm anymore. She was proving something to herself. The work was still demanding. The hours were still long. But Ellie had found her place, and that place was not in the shadow of Alexander Hunt's generosity or the condescending smiles of the senior partners. It was in the work she did, the cases she helped win, the respect she earned every single day. And in the moments when she sat in the conference room, contributing to legal discussions with the same conviction as the most seasoned attorneys, Ellie realized that she had finally arrived not just in this firm, but in her life. One afternoon, as she reviewed the details of an upcoming trial, Alexander called her into his office. The tone of his voice was familiar, calm, professional, but there was a hint of something more behind it. Ellie's stomach tightened with curiosity. She had come to trust Alexander, to see him not just as a CEO or mentor, but as someone who truly believed in her. But what was this meeting about? When she entered his office, she found him standing by the window, looking out over the city. The setting sun cast long shadows over the room, and for the first time, Alexander didn't seem like the same powerful CEO. He seemed more human. "Ellie," he said, his voice low, but with a hint of emotion that made her pause. "I've been thinking a lot about everything that's happened, about how far you've come. Ellie felt her heart skip. What do you mean? He turned to face her, his eyes softening. When I first met you, I saw potential, but I didn't realize just how much you were capable of. You've become more than just a part of this firm. You've become a part of something bigger, and I want you to know that I'm proud of you. Ellie's breath caught in her throat. Alexander Hunt, a man who had built his empire from nothing, was standing there, looking at her with pride. And for the first time, Ellie allowed herself to feel the full weight of what that meant. But then Alexander did something unexpected. He walked toward her, pulling something from his desk, a small envelope. "This is for you," he said, handing it to her. Ellie looked down at the envelope, confused. "What's this?" Alexander smiled slightly. "It's your next step. I've talked to the board. We're officially offering you a full-time associate position with the firm." Ellie's breath caught, and for a moment, she couldn't find her voice. This was it, the moment she had dreamed of for so long. The recognition, the opportunity to stand on her own, not just as someone who had fought her way in, but as someone who truly belonged. Tears stung her eyes, but she quickly blinked them away. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," Alexander said gently. "You've already said it with your actions." Ellie stood there for a moment, the weight of the offer settling in. She had done it. She had earned it, and no one could take that away from her. She wasn't just Ellie Parker, the janitor who dreamed of being a lawyer. She was Ellie Parker, an associate at one of the most prestigious law firms in New York, and she wasn't done yet. The confession. The days that followed Ellie's promotion passed in a whirlwind of new responsibilities and challenges. As an official associate at Hunt & Langford, her workload multiplied, and she was expected to meet a higher standard than ever before. But despite the long hours and mounting pressure, Ellie felt an unfamiliar sense of peace settle in her heart. She had earned her place, and now, with every challenge she overcame, she proved it more to herself than anyone else. Yet, with all the success, there was still one question that lingered in Ellie's mind. What exactly was her relationship with Alexander? They had shared countless moments, discussions over legal cases, late nights in the office, and shared glances that carried more meaning than words ever could. But there was always a distance between them, a professional boundary that neither of them had crossed, despite the growing bond they seemed to share. Ellie wasn't sure if it was her lingering insecurities or the fear of losing the career she had fought so hard to build, but she hadn't allowed herself to acknowledge the growing connection between them. One evening, as Ellie was wrapping up some final research in her office, Alexander knocked and entered without waiting for her to answer. He looked tired, his usual impeccable suit now slightly wrinkled, his eyes showing signs of long hours. "Mind if I join you?" he asked with a half-smile. Ellie nodded, a bit surprised by his sudden appearance. As he sat across from her, Ellie could feel the weight of the silence between them, the unspoken tension that had been building over the weeks. She could tell Alexander was struggling with something. He seemed almost nervous, a side of him she had never seen before. "Ellie," he started, his voice unusually soft. "I've been thinking about something for a while now, and I'm not sure how to say it." His words hung in the air, and Ellie's heart began to race. Was this it? Was he about to say what she had been dreading, what they had both been avoiding? "I know you've worked incredibly hard to get here, and I've watched you grow, not just as a lawyer, but as a person. You've done more than anyone could have imagined." He paused, looking away for a moment, collecting his thoughts. "But there's something I've realized. Something about us. About the way I've been looking at you." Ellie's heart skipped a beat. She couldn't deny that her feelings for him had changed over time. What had started as admiration for his success and leadership had evolved into something much deeper. But she had never allowed herself to fully acknowledge it. She wasn't sure what to say, so she stayed silent, waiting for him to continue. "I don't want you to think that I've been helping you because of some obligation," Alexander continued, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "And I don't want you to think I see you as just a project or someone I've been trying to fix." Ellie felt a lump form in her throat. She had always wondered if that was how he saw her, someone he helped out of pity or out of a sense of duty. But now, hearing his words, she could sense the sincerity in his voice. "I've admired you for a long time, Ellie. Not just for your intellect or your work ethic, but for who you are. And I think—" He hesitated, his eyes meeting hers. "I think I'm falling for you." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, everything else faded away. Ellie's breath caught in her throat, and her pulse quickened. She had always wondered if there was something between them, but hearing him say it out loud, hearing him admit it, shook her to her core. For a moment, Ellie couldn't find her words. But as the silence stretched on, something inside her shifted. She had spent so much time focusing on her career, on proving herself to others, that she had never fully allowed herself to feel something for someone else. And now, here it was, this unexpected confession. I don't know what to say," she finally whispered, her voice barely above a breath. "You don't have to say anything," Alexander replied quietly. "I just needed you to know. No matter where we go from here, I want you to know that I'm here for you. All of you." Ellie's heart raced as she processed his words. For the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to acknowledge the feelings she had buried deep down. Maybe, just maybe, there was room for more than just work, more than just ambition. There was room for something real. And for the first time, Ellie felt like she wasn't walking this path alone. The unspoken future. The days after Alexander's confession felt surreal to Ellie. Everything seemed to shift around her, though on the surface, nothing changed. The work was still demanding, the cases were still high stakes, and the hours were still long. But something inside her had shifted, and every time she walked through the office doors, it felt like she was seeing it through new eyes. Alexander's words echoed in her mind, but the doubts she had carried with her for so long hadn't disappeared. She wasn't sure what to make of their growing connection. Yes, there was a deep respect between them, a mutual admiration that had blossomed over time. But was there more? Could there be more? She wasn't sure if she was ready to let her guard down completely. After everything she had fought for, she couldn't afford to lose herself in something she wasn't entirely certain about. But every time she looked at him, really looked at him, Ellie felt the walls she had carefully constructed around her heart begin to crumble. Alexander wasn't just the CEO anymore. He wasn't just her boss or mentor. He was a person who saw her, who understood her struggles, who respected her for everything she had worked so hard to achieve. And that meant something. One evening, after a particularly grueling day filled with back-to-back meetings and tight deadlines, Ellie found herself alone in her office, staring at her computer screen. The weight of her decision, the question of whether she could allow herself to be vulnerable, hung heavily in the air. She needed answers, but she knew the only person who could give them to her was herself. As she stood up and stretched, ready to call it a day, her phone buzzed. It was a message from Alexander. "I was thinking of grabbing a drink after work. I'd like to talk about the future ours and the firms. If you're interested, meet me at the bar across the street. No work talk, just us." Ellie stared at the message for a moment, her heart thudding in her chest. It was an invitation, but it felt like so much more. Alexander was offering her something outside of the firm, outside of the rigid professional boundaries that had always defined their relationship. This wasn't about work. It was about the two of them, alone, outside of the office. And for the first time, Ellie realized that maybe this was the moment to stop questioning everything and start living in the moment. She quickly typed a response, her fingers trembling slightly. "I'll be there." When Ellie walked into the dimly lit bar later that evening, she found Alexander sitting at a small table near the back. He looked up as she entered, and for a moment, the room seemed to fade away. It was just the two of them, and Ellie felt a wave of calm wash over her. "You made it," Alexander said, his smile warm and welcoming. He stood as she approached, pulling out the chair across from him. "I wasn't sure if you'd come." Ellie smiled softly, sitting down. "You weren't the only one uncertain," she replied, her voice light, but carrying a deeper meaning. As the night unfolded, they talked. About the firm, about their work, and, most importantly, about the future. But as the conversation turned personal, Ellie felt the walls she had carefully built around her heart begin to crumble. Alexander wasn't just the man who had given her a chance at her dream. He was someone who understood her, someone who saw the value in her beyond the title she held. And for the first time, Ellie realized that maybe, just maybe, this was the start of something real. Crossing the line. The days that followed the evening at the bar felt different. Ellie couldn't pinpoint exactly what had changed, but the connection between her and Alexander had deepened. There was a newfound ease in their interactions. What had once been rigid and professional now seemed fluid, almost effortless. They still maintained their roles, he, the CEO, and she, the associate. But there was an unspoken understanding that things were evolving, and neither of them seemed to be in a hurry to define what that meant just yet. But it was impossible to ignore the way things had shifted. They were no longer just colleagues, no longer just mentor and mentee. Ellie could feel the chemistry building between them, the quiet moments of connection that were impossible to ignore. Every time their hands brushed or their eyes met, there was a spark, a pull, something undeniable. One Friday evening, after another late work session, Ellie stood in the elevator, her mind swirling with thoughts of the future. She had been wrestling with the idea of what came next. The firm, the work, the future Alexander had promised, they were all so overwhelming. But in the midst of everything, there was this part of her that felt like the pieces of her life were finally falling into place. Maybe it wasn't perfect. Maybe it wasn't exactly what she had imagined, but it was hers. When the elevator doors opened to the 42nd floor, Ellie stepped out and made her way to her office. But as she reached for the door, she froze. Through the glass windows of Alexander's office, she saw him sitting at his desk, his phone pressed to his ear. His voice was low, but she could hear the tension in his tone. "I don't care what you think. I've made my decision. It's final," he said, his words sharp. He paused for a moment, as if listening to someone on the other end. "This is my firm, and I will do what I think is best for it. That includes the changes with Ellie." Ellie's heart skipped. Her name. The mention of her name. Her mind raced, but she didn't move, frozen in place. What was he talking about? Was this about the fellowship program, the legal initiative, or was it something more personal? She had no idea. Her thoughts were interrupted as Alexander hung up the phone. He turned to look out of the window, his face a mask of frustration. The moment felt heavy, filled with tension and unspoken words. Ellie stood there, unsure of what to do. She hadn't meant to overhear this. It wasn't her place to invade his privacy, but the words lingered in her mind. She took a deep breath and walked into his office without knocking. Alexander didn't seem surprised to see her. He simply looked up, his expression softening for a moment before returning to the composed demeanor she had grown so familiar with. "Ellie," he said, his voice low but steady. "I didn't expect you to be here." She nodded, walking toward his desk, trying to ignore the swirl of emotions in her chest. "I heard part of the conversation," she admitted, her voice tight. "Is everything okay?" Alexander didn't immediately respond. Instead, he stood and walked over to the window, his back to her for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than usual. "This isn't easy," he said, his tone a mix of frustration and determination. "I've been trying to keep things balanced, but it's hard when the firm doesn't see what I see in you." Ellie's heart thudded in her chest. She had no idea where this conversation was going, but the uncertainty in Alexander's voice made her question everything. She stepped closer, her voice steady but unsure. "What do you see in me, Alexander?" He turned to face her, his eyes filled with something unreadable. "I see someone who has fought for every inch of this. Someone who's not afraid to stand up for what's right. Someone who deserves more than what the world has handed her." The silence between them stretched for a long moment, both of them standing there, unsure of what came next. Ellie's chest tightened with the weight of his words. "I didn't want you to find out like this, Alexander continued, his voice quieter now, almost apologetic. But I've been fighting for you, for us, and I didn't want you to think I was doing this for any other reason than because I believe in you. Ellie stood still, trying to process everything that had been said. But one thing was clear. They had crossed a line, and whatever came next, they couldn't go back. The crossroads. The silence in Alexander's office was deafening, the weight of the moment settling over them like a heavy cloud. Ellie's mind raced, but she couldn't find the right words. What was he saying? What did this all mean? She had always been so focused on her career, on proving herself in a world that had never truly welcomed her. And now, standing in front of Alexander, she realized that the path ahead was no longer just about the firm, the fellowship, or even the work she had poured her heart into. It was about something bigger. It was about her and him, and the unspoken tension that had been building between them for so long. I didn't want this to become complicated, Alexander said, his voice soft but firm. He ran a hand through his hair, his frustration evident. But I can't ignore how I feel anymore. I can't pretend that I don't care about you. Ellie felt a strange mixture of emotions. Relief, fear, excitement flood her chest all at once. She had spent so much time trying to keep her distance from Alexander, trying to separate their personal feelings from the professional space they shared. But now, with his words hanging in the air, she realized that their connection had always been more than just professional. It had always been something deeper, something neither of them had been willing to fully admit until now. She took a deep breath and stepped forward, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside her. I care about you too, Alexander. But this, she gestured between them, her hands trembling slightly. This isn't just about us, is it? We've crossed lines here. I've fought so hard to be seen for my work, to prove that I belong in this world, and I don't know how to separate that from whatever this is between us. Alexander's gaze softened, and he took a step closer to her. I never wanted to take that away from you, he said, his voice low. You've earned everything you have here, and I respect that more than you'll ever know. But I also want you to know that I don't want to just be your boss or your mentor. I want to be something more. And I know that means taking a risk. Ellie's heart pounded in her chest. She hadn't expected this, not from him, not from herself, but the words were out there now, the truth hanging between them. She wasn't sure where they could go from here or if they could even make it work. She had never been good at mixing business with personal matters. But as she looked into Alexander's eyes, something inside her shifted. Maybe it was time to take a chance. Maybe it was time to let herself feel something more than just the relentless pursuit of success. I'm not sure I'm ready for all of this, Ellie said quietly, her voice catching in her throat. But maybe it's time we stop pretending that we're not both in this. Alexander smiled softly, a look of understanding crossing his face. He didn't push her, didn't demand an immediate answer. I'm not asking you to decide right now, but when you're ready, I'll be here, whatever that means. Ellie nodded slowly, feeling a sense of relief wash over her. For the first time in a long while, she felt like she wasn't alone in this. She wasn't just fighting for a place at the table anymore. She was fighting for something more personal, more real. And maybe, just maybe, it was time to let herself be seen not just as the lawyer or the associate, but as the woman who had finally found something worth fighting for. A leap of faith. The days after that conversation with Alexander felt like the calm before a storm. Ellie found herself drifting between a world of professional success and a world of personal uncertainty. Every morning she entered the firm with her head held high, knowing she had earned her place here. But every night, when she returned to her small apartment in Queens, her mind would replay Alexander's words, the sincerity in his voice, the uncertainty in her own heart. She couldn't ignore it. She couldn't ignore him. The connection between them had always been there, lingering like a quiet hum in the background. But now, with everything out in the open, Ellie realized that the real challenge wasn't just proving herself to the firm or to her colleagues, It was allowing herself to trust in the feelings she had tried so hard to suppress. She had spent her entire life keeping people at a distance, pushing aside anything that threatened to distract her from her goals. But now, with Alexander, it was different. She stood on the edge of something she had never allowed herself to believe in something real. Something she had always told herself wasn't for people like her. But as the days passed and their paths continued to cross, she realized that maybe she didn't need to fight this anymore. Maybe she didn't need to do it alone. One evening, after a particularly exhausting day at the office, Ellie stood in front of the mirror in her apartment, preparing to head out for another long night of work. But this time, something inside her shifted. She didn't need to keep pushing herself so hard, so relentlessly. She had already proven herself. Now it was time to let herself live. As she grabbed her coat and headed out the door, her phone buzzed with a message from Alexander. "I know it's late, but I was wondering if you'd like to grab dinner. I think we both deserve a break." Her heart skipped a beat. She hadn't expected him to reach out, especially after everything they had talked about. But here it was, an invitation, not for work, not for any professional reason, but because he wanted to spend time with her. She smiled, her fingers typing a quick response. "I'd like that." The evening passed in a blur of laughter, conversation, and something deeper than either of them had acknowledged before. Over dinner, Alexander didn't speak about the firm or the future. Instead, they talked about everything else: childhood memories, dreams, the small things that made life beautiful despite the chaos. There was a lightness to the night, a freedom that Ellie had been craving for so long. For the first time in ages, she didn't feel like she was running a race, constantly trying to prove her worth. She just felt seen, not as the janitor who had made it, not as the associate trying to climb the ladder, but as Ellie. By the end of the night, as they stood outside the restaurant, Alexander turned to her, his eyes reflecting the streetlights around them. "I don't want you to feel like you have to keep up these walls with me," he said softly. "I'm here, with you." Ellie felt something shift inside her, a warmth that had nothing to do with the cold night air. She had fought so hard for so long, but now, for the first time, she felt like it was okay to let someone else in. "I'm ready," she said, her voice steady, but filled with something new. "I'm ready to stop pretending, to stop running." Alexander's smile was gentle, understanding. And for the first time in a long while, Ellie didn't feel like she had to fight anymore. Not for the respect she deserved, not for her place at the table, and not for her happiness. Maybe it wasn't a fairy tale, but it was something real, and that was enough. The choice. The weeks that followed Ellie's realization were a whirlwind of change. She was still every bit as driven as she had been before, still giving her all to her cases, still working tirelessly to prove herself in the legal world. But now, there was a new balance in her life. She no longer felt like she was fighting alone. Alexander was there, not just as her boss or mentor, but as someone she could trust, someone who respected her both professionally and personally. At the same time, Ellie couldn't ignore the pressure that continued to mount from every direction. The firm's atmosphere, despite the growing respect she earned, still carried an undercurrent of skepticism. There were still those who looked at her and wondered if she truly belonged, if she had truly earned her place, or if her connection to Alexander had been the real reason she was there. Even as she achieved more, it felt like she was constantly having to fight the perception that she was merely a product of Alexander's favor. But Ellie was learning to navigate the tension. She had worked too hard and too long to let anyone diminish her accomplishments. She wasn't just the janitor who made it. She was Ellie Parker, the woman who fought for what she wanted and had earned every single inch of her success. And nothing, not even the whispers or the rumors, could take that away from her. One evening, as she walked out of her office, ready to head home after another long day, her phone buzzed. It was a text from Alexander. "We need to talk. It's about the future, my future, and yours." Ellie's heart skipped. The words were casual, but there was something about them that made her pause. It was rare for Alexander to send a message like this, especially when things between them had been so uncertain. He wasn't one for making grand gestures, and yet, in this moment, she could feel the weight of what was coming. When she arrived at his office, the door was slightly ajar. She knocked before entering, her nerves rising with every step. Alexander was standing by the window, his back to her, a silhouette against the glow of the city lights. "Come in," he said softly, without turning. Ellie stepped inside, closing the door behind her. The air between them was heavy, thick with anticipation. Alexander turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "Ellie," he began, his voice quieter than usual, "I've been doing a lot of thinking. About everything. About you and me. About the firm. About what comes next for both of us." Ellie's stomach twisted, but she remained silent, waiting for him to continue. "I want to take things further. I don't just want us to work together. I don't just want us to be boss and associate. I want to build something real with you. I've been scared, afraid that mixing business with personal feelings could ruin everything, but I can't ignore how I feel anymore. I want more with you, Ellie. I want a future." His words hung in the air like a confession, vulnerable and raw. Ellie's heart raced. Everything in her told her to hesitate, to protect herself. But as she looked into his eyes, she knew that this was the moment when she had to choose, to take a leap of faith or to stay in the safety of the life she knew. "I don't know what the future holds," she said, her voice steady but full of emotion. "But I'm willing to find out with you, together." In that moment, everything shifted. There were no more walls between them, no more doubts about what they meant to each other. They had both taken the leap, and now, for the first time, they were ready to see where it would take them. The leap together. The days following Ellie's decision felt different. Lighter, even. It was as though a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. The kind of weight that comes from carrying a secret for so long, unsure whether it would destroy everything. But now that the truth had been spoken, both hers and Alexander's, there was an undeniable shift in the air between them. They began to work together differently. Their interactions, while still professional, carried an undercurrent of something deeper, something unspoken, but understood. They no longer felt the need to keep their distance or hide the connection they shared. They had crossed a line, yes, but it wasn't a line they wanted to walk back across. This wasn't about mixing business and personal lives. It was about creating something that was theirs. A partnership built on respect, trust, and above all, honesty. The firm, however, hadn't entirely shifted. The whispers, the sideways glances, and the subtle tension in the air still lingered. But Ellie had learned not to let it affect her. She had earned her place here, and no one could take that away from her, not the rumors, not the doubts, not even the fear of losing everything she had worked for. She was not the janitor who had made it. She was a brilliant, capable woman who had fought her way to the top. One afternoon, as Ellie walked through the firm's hallways, she passed a group of senior associates talking in hushed tones. She caught snippets of their conversation, words like favoritism and unqualified, and her heart sank. She had known it would come, had known that people would question her. But now, it stung. The whispers were no longer just about her background, they were about her relationship with Alexander. For a brief moment, Ellie considered retreating, avoiding the confrontation. But she stopped herself. She had nothing to prove to them anymore. She wasn't here because of Alexander. She wasn't here because of some lucky break. She was here because she had earned it. And if anyone doubted that, they could keep talking. She wasn't going anywhere. That evening, after a long day, she found herself sitting across from Alexander at their usual restaurant. The dim lighting and the quiet hum of conversations around them made it feel like a safe space, a place where they could just be. As they shared a quiet dinner, Ellie's mind wandered to the future, their future. "What happens next?" she asked softly, breaking the comfortable silence between them. Her eyes met his, a little nervous, a little unsure. Alexander smiled, a small, reassuring smile that told her everything she needed to know. "We keep going. We keep building. Together." His words were simple, but they held so much meaning. This wasn't the end. It wasn't a fairy tale conclusion or a final destination. It was the beginning of something new, something they had both chosen to step into with open hearts and open minds. Ellie smiled back, feeling something warm bloom inside her. She didn't need to have all the answers. All she needed was the courage to take the next step, and to know that Alexander would be there beside her every step of the way. And for the first time, Ellie felt like she had everything she ever needed, not just in her career, but in her life. She had love. She had respect. She had herself. The uncharted path. Weeks passed, and with each passing day, Ellie found herself settling into this new phase of her life, both personally and professionally. She had no illusions that everything would be smooth sailing from here on out. The firm still held its complexities, its office politics, and its unspoken rules. But Ellie was no longer the same woman who had walked in through those doors years ago, fighting for every inch of respect and recognition. Now she stood tall with the quiet confidence of someone who knew their worth, who knew they had earned their place. Alexander was still a constant presence in her life, not just as her mentor or boss, but as her partner, someone who understood her struggles, celebrated her victories, and challenged her to be more than she ever thought she could be. They had found a rhythm together, one that felt natural, built on mutual respect and understanding. Despite the progress, there were still moments when Ellie felt the old doubts creeping in. There were still those who whispered behind her back, still people who questioned her position at the firm, still colleagues who eyed her with suspicion. She could feel the weight of their judgment, like an invisible hand pressing down on her shoulders. But Ellie had learned to stand tall in the face of it. She was not here by accident, and she didn't need anyone's approval to validate that. One late evening, as Ellie stayed behind to finish some legal briefs, she overheard a conversation in the hallway just outside her office. Her heart sank when she recognized the voices of two senior partners. "I still don't get how she got this far," one of them said. "I mean, she's barely been here a year, and suddenly she's everywhere on every major case, handling the big clients. It doesn't sit right with me." Ellie's fingers paused over her keyboard. She knew they were talking about her. The words stung, but she didn't let them sink in. She had been here before hearing the whispers, feeling the weight of other people's opinions. What mattered now was how she responded, how she carried herself. And in this moment, her response was simple. She kept working. A few minutes later, Alexander walked past her office, paused, and then stepped inside. His usual calm demeanor was replaced with a more serious expression. "You heard that, didn't you?" Ellie didn't have to ask what he was referring to. She nodded. "I hear the whispers every day." Alexander leaned against the doorframe, his eyes thoughtful. "Ignore them," he said. "The firm's not ready for someone like you. But that's their problem, not yours." Ellie smiled faintly, appreciating his words, but there was a part of her that still felt the sting of being underestimated. "It's hard sometimes," she admitted, her voice softer than usual. "I've worked so hard, and it still feels like I have to fight for every ounce of respect." "I know," he said gently, stepping closer, "but you've already won. You've earned it, and no matter what they say, they can't take that away from you." His words were a balm to her weary soul, and in that moment, Ellie felt something shift inside her. She wasn't fighting to prove anyone wrong. She was fighting for herself, for her own worth, for the future she was building. And that, in the end, was all that mattered. For the first time in a long while, Ellie let herself breathe. She was no longer defined by the opinions of others. She was defined by her actions, her resilience, and the path she was carving for herself. The road ahead was still uncertain, but it was hers to walk. And with Alexander by her side, she knew she wasn't walking it alone. The road ahead. As the weeks passed, Ellie's confidence continued to grow. She was no longer just a part of the team, she was integral to it. Her insights, her ability to see things others missed, had earned her the respect of even the most skeptical partners. Yet the firm's old guard still struggled with her presence. They couldn't easily accept a woman who had risen so quickly from the lower ranks, a woman who didn't fit the mold of their traditional expectations. But Ellie had long since stopped seeking validation from anyone but herself. She was no longer the uncertain young woman who had doubted her place here. She was Ellie Parker, the associate who had fought tooth and nail for everything she had earned, the woman who refused to let anyone, whether through whispers or condescension, define her worth. And no one could take that away from her. Late one afternoon, as Ellie was wrapping up another round of revisions on a complex contract, she received a message from Alexander. "I need to see you in my office. It's about the next step." Her heart skipped a beat. The next step had been on her mind for days, a vague idea that hovered in the back of her thoughts, but never quite came into focus. She had been waiting for a sign, some indication of what the future held, not just for her career, but for her and Alexander. They had come a long way, from mentor and mentee to something more, but she still wasn't sure how it all fit into the bigger picture. When Ellie entered Alexander's office, she found him standing by the window, his back to her as usual. But this time, there was a different air about him. He wasn't wearing his usual suit jacket. His sleeves were rolled up, his posture more relaxed, almost as though he had let go of some invisible weight. "Ellie," he said, turning toward her. His voice was warm, but there was a hint of uncertainty in his eyes. "I've been thinking a lot about what's next for both of us, and I've come to a decision." Ellie's pulse quickened. She had no idea where this conversation would lead, but she knew one thing for sure. Whatever decision Alexander had made, it was going to change things. "Go on," she said, trying to steady her nerves, though her heart was racing. "I'm proposing a partnership," he said, stepping closer to her. "Not just in the firm, but in everything we do. You've proven yourself time and again, and I want to make sure you know that you're not just here because of me. You're here because you've earned it. I'm offering you a real seat at the table." Ellie's breath caught. A partnership? In the firm? In life? She didn't know what to say. The words felt too big, too permanent. She had fought for so long to get where she was, and now Alexander was offering her something she hadn't dared to dream of. A future not defined by struggle, but by something deeper, something more meaningful. "This is everything I've worked for," Ellie said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But it's also terrifying." Alexander nodded, understanding the fear in her eyes. "It should be, but it's also a chance to build something together, a future where we're not defined by what others think, but by what we choose." Ellie stood there for a moment, the weight of his words sinking in. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time, Ellie wasn't afraid. She was ready to walk it, no matter where it led. "I'm in," she said, her voice steady. Alexander smiled, a real smile this time, warm and full of possibility. "Then let's begin." And just like that, Ellie knew the path ahead was no longer about fighting for her place. It was about creating a future that was entirely her own. A new beginning. The decision Ellie made that day marked the start of something new. No longer was she just climbing a corporate ladder, she was helping to build something from the ground up. And as the days passed, it became clear that this wasn't just a shift in her career, it was a shift in her life. With her new role as an official partner at Hunt & Langford LLP, Ellie was no longer a passive observer in the firm's future. She had a voice, a seat at the table. The weight of the decision had settled in, but she felt stronger for it, more confident than ever before. Alexander had kept his promise. He trusted her, and in turn, she trusted herself more than she ever had. The days in the office felt different now. No longer was there a sense of trying to prove herself. She had earned her place. The senior partners who had once questioned her every move now sought her out for advice, and the once constant whispers had quieted. Ellie had become a force in the firm, a force to be reckoned with. But it wasn't just her professional success that stood out, it was the way she carried herself. With each passing day, she walked the halls with a new sense of purpose. Still, the road ahead wasn't without its challenges. The world of high-powered law firms wasn't one that let go of its old ways easily, and Ellie knew she would have to fight for every inch of respect. But she had learned that nothing in life worth having came without a fight, and she was prepared for whatever came next. At home, things were no less complicated. Her relationship with Alexander, while growing stronger, also brought its own set of challenges. They were no longer just colleagues, they were partners, in every sense of the word. And though they had crossed many boundaries in the last few months, there were still moments of uncertainty, moments where Ellie wondered if she was truly ready for everything this new chapter would bring. One evening, after another long day at the office, Ellie and Alexander sat in their favorite spot at the restaurant they frequented. It had become their place, a quiet refuge where they could talk, laugh, and just be. The conversation that night, however, was different. The usual light-hearted banter was replaced by something more serious, more reflective. "Ellie, there's something I've been meaning to ask," Alexander said, looking at her with an intensity she wasn't used to. Ellie raised an eyebrow, her curiosity piqued. "What is it?" He paused for a moment, gathering his thoughts. "Now that we're both in this, now that we've made this choice together, how do we move forward? How do we build a future that isn't just about us, but about the world we want to create?" Ellie sat back, considering his words. The question wasn't just about their relationship. It was about everything they had worked for, everything they wanted to achieve. They weren't just shaping their personal futures. They were shaping something bigger. "We move forward one step at a time," she said, her voice calm but filled with conviction. "And we make sure that every decision we make reflects who we are and who we want to be, together." Alexander's gaze softened. He nodded slowly, understanding the weight of her words. "Together," he repeated, a quiet promise in his voice. And for the first time in a long time, Ellie felt truly at peace. The road ahead was still uncertain, but she wasn't walking it alone. And that, she realized, was enough. Building together. With each passing day, the weight of their shared decision became more tangible. Ellie and Alexander, now true partners in every sense of the word, found themselves navigating uncharted waters. The dynamic between them had shifted. No longer was it about her trying to prove herself in the firm. Now, it was about building something lasting, not just for themselves, but for the legacy they wanted to create together. At the firm, Ellie stepped into her new role with a quiet confidence. She had always known she was capable, but now, as an equal, her voice carried more weight. The senior partners who had once questioned her ability now sought her out for guidance, and her opinions were respected in ways they hadn't been before. But it wasn't the recognition that mattered most. What truly fulfilled Ellie was the feeling that she was making a difference, not just in the firm, but in the world of law itself. She and Alexander had started to tackle more significant cases together, cases that required not only legal expertise, but a shared vision. They worked side by side, the partnership that had begun as a professional alliance, evolving into a deeply personal one. Their chemistry was undeniable, both in and out of the office. They had become a well-oiled machine, complementing each other's strengths and picking up the slack where needed. Still, the challenges were real. The more Ellie rose in the firm, the more she found herself facing resistance, not just from clients, but from others within the company who were reluctant to embrace change. Some colleagues were still uncomfortable with her rapid ascent, unsure of her methods, questioning her every decision. But Ellie had learned not to back down. She had earned her seat at the table, and she wasn't about to let anyone push her away. One afternoon, as she sat across from Alexander in his office, discussing a new strategy for an important case, the conversation took a more personal turn. "I've been thinking," Alexander began, his voice quiet, but his eyes intense, "about everything we've built so far, but also about the future, about us, about what comes next." Ellie's heart skipped a beat, sensing the seriousness in his tone. They had come so far, both professionally and personally, but the road ahead was still unclear. She wasn't sure where this conversation was leading, but she knew it was important. "What are you thinking?" she asked, her voice steady, but filled with curiosity. He leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. "I want to build something bigger than just our success here. I want us to make a real impact on the firm, on the people we serve, and on the world. But it won't be easy. It's going to require more of both of us." Ellie listened, taking in his words. She had always been driven by a desire to make a difference, to prove that success wasn't just about power, but about using that power to help others. And now, with Alexander by her side, that vision seemed more possible than ever. "I'm in," she said simply, her voice unwavering. "Whatever it takes, I'm in." Alexander smiled, a small but genuine smile. "I knew you would be." Together, they were ready to build something that was bigger than them. They weren't just shaping their own futures, they were shaping the future of the firm, of their lives, and of the people they hoped to inspire along the way. And as they faced the unknown, they did it with one unshakable truth. They weren't just partners in business, they were partners in life. And together, there was nothing they couldn't achieve. A united front. The next few months were a whirlwind. Ellie and Alexander, now united not only by their shared goals, but by the deeper bond they had formed, began to push the firm toward uncharted territories. Their partnership, professional and personal, grew stronger each day as they navigated high-profile cases, made bold decisions, and faced the occasional resistance from those who weren't yet ready for change. The cases they took on together were some of the most challenging Ellie had ever encountered, but they also became the most rewarding. With Alexander's sharp strategic mind and Ellie's intuitive grasp of the law, they were a force to be reckoned with. Together, they shaped the direction of the firm, focusing on not just profitability, but ethical responsibility and social impact. One afternoon, as they sat in a conference room, poring over a major case involving a multinational corporation accused of exploiting workers in developing countries, the weight of the work they were doing hit Ellie. The stakes had never been higher. This case wasn't just about winning. It was about justice. "Do you ever stop to think about how far we've come?" Ellie asked, her voice soft but filled with awe. She hadn't expected to get emotional, but the reality of their journey together was overwhelming. From her humble beginnings as a janitor to sitting in this conference room, tackling cases that could change lives, it felt surreal. Alexander looked at her with a slight smile, his eyes gleaming with both pride and determination. "Every day," he replied. "But I don't think about it much. We've only just begun. There's still so much more to do, so much more to change." Ellie nodded, feeling a deep sense of purpose stir within her. The world they were creating together, both in the firm and beyond it, was one she had always dreamed of, but never thought possible. And it was theirs, all theirs. As they discussed the case further, Ellie felt Alexander's presence next to her more than ever. They were no longer just colleagues, they were partners. And that partnership, she realized, was more than just professional. It was personal. It was a bond forged not only in the boardrooms and conference rooms of Hunt & Langford LLP, but in every challenge they had faced together, every late night, every conversation that had brought them closer. Later that evening, as they wrapped up for the day and headed to their favorite bar to unwind, the topic of their future once again crept into their conversation. It wasn't something they discussed often, the unknowns of their life together. But Ellie had been thinking about it more and more. "What's next for us?" she asked, her tone a mixture of excitement and uncertainty. "In the firm, in our lives? What are we really building?" Alexander looked at her, his expression serious but full of promise. "We're building a legacy, Ellie. Not just for the firm, but for ourselves. A future where we don't just lead in the legal world, but in the world at large. A future where we make a real difference." Ellie's heart swelled with emotion. She was no longer just following a path laid out for her. She was creating it, walking side by side with Alexander, building a future that was bigger than them, bigger than anything they had ever imagined. And in that moment, as the lights of the city flickered around them, Ellie knew that they were exactly where they needed to be together, facing whatever came next, with the strength of their love and the power of their partnership guiding them forward. The turning point. As Ellie and Alexander continued to build their future, the challenges they faced only seemed to grow in scale. Their personal and professional lives were becoming more intertwined, and with every new case they tackled, the stakes felt higher. But Ellie was no longer intimidated by the pressure. She had transformed in ways she never expected, and the fear that once held her back had given way to a quiet strength, one she wasn't sure she had before. Together, they made a formidable team. While Alexander's strategic brilliance led their cases, Ellie's intuition and ability to connect the dots often brought them over the finish line. They had become partners in the truest sense of the word, not just in their legal work, but in their approach to life. They saw each other's weaknesses and strengths, and they filled in the gaps where needed. Their bond was deeper than love. It was built on trust, shared ambition, and a shared desire to create something meaningful. However, with all the success came new obstacles. Ellie's rise in the firm hadn't gone unnoticed, and while most of the senior partners had come to respect her, there were still those who couldn't accept the speed of her ascent. Rumors persisted, and Ellie often found herself walking into rooms where the tension was palpable, where her every move was scrutinized. But it wasn't just about the firm anymore. Ellie's sense of self, her belief in what they were building, had become more resilient. Alexander, too, felt the weight of their decisions. His leadership of the firm had been challenged more than once, especially as they pushed for reforms that some weren't ready for. But he was unshaken. Together, they had faced the corporate world's resistance, and they would continue to do so. One late afternoon, after yet another high-stakes meeting, Alexander pulled Ellie aside. The look on his face was more serious than usual. "Ellie," he began, his voice low, "I've been thinking about the future. I know we've talked about it before, but I think it's time to really take a step forward, not just in the firm, but in everything. I want us to start something that's bigger than anything we've done so far." Ellie's heart raced. She had heard the tone in his voice before he was proposing something big, something life-changing. She waited for him to continue, her curiosity piqued. "I want us to create a foundation," he said, his gaze fixed on her. "A foundation for legal reform, for fighting against inequality, for giving voices to those who've been silenced. We have the power, the platform, and the resources to do something real. I believe we're ready for it." Ellie's breath caught in her throat. This wasn't just a new project, it was the culmination of everything they had worked toward. A chance to create lasting change. She had never thought this big, but as she looked at Alexander, she realized that they had the power to do something extraordinary together. "I'm in," she said, her voice steady with determination. "Let's do it. Together." And just like that, they stepped into a new chapter of their journey, one that promised not just professional success, but the kind of meaningful impact they had always dreamed of. The foundation. The decision to start the foundation was a turning point. Ellie and Alexander had always been focused on their work, on their climb to the top, but now they had a bigger vision, a purpose beyond success and profit. The idea of using their resources, their influence, and their skills to make a meaningful impact on the world was something neither of them had ever truly considered until now. But with everything they had accomplished, it felt like the next natural step. They began the process of building the foundation slowly, carefully. They knew that starting something like this wasn't going to be easy. There would be bureaucracy, resistance, and plenty of people who would try to stop them. But they also knew that they were more than capable of tackling whatever came their way. They had already faced countless obstacles together and had come out stronger each time. This was no different. The mission was clear: to provide legal resources to underserved communities, to fight for social justice, and to help those who had been ignored by the system. They didn't just want to donate money or provide grants, they wanted to be hands-on, to make sure the people who needed help most were getting the legal support they deserved. They would tackle cases that mattered, make changes where it counted, and be the voice for the voiceless. As they worked on the foundation's infrastructure, Ellie found herself reflecting on how far she had come. She had once been a janitor, scrubbing floors in a high-rise building, dreaming of a future where she could make a difference. Now she was on the verge of doing just that, not just in the firm, but in the world at large. It was a humbling thought, and it made her even more determined to make the foundation a success. She wasn't just doing this for herself anymore. She was doing it for everyone who had ever been overlooked or underestimated, for everyone who had been silenced by the system. Alexander, too, was deeply invested in the foundation. While his primary role had always been at the helm of Hunt and Langford, he was committed to ensuring that their new venture succeeded. He knew that this project was bigger than anything they had done before. It wasn't about money or power, it was about leaving a legacy that would change lives for generations to come. As they sat together in their shared office late one evening, reviewing legal documents for the Foundation's first major initiative, Alexander looked at Ellie, his eyes filled with a quiet resolve. "You know, this is just the beginning," he said, his voice steady but filled with conviction. "We've always been focused on the firm, but now we have a chance to really change things, to do something that matters." Ellie nodded, feeling a rush of pride. "This is bigger than anything we've ever done, and I can't wait to see where it takes us." Together, they were embarking on a journey that would take them beyond the world they knew, a journey that would shape not just their futures, but the future of countless others. It was a leap into the unknown, but with each other by their side, they knew they were ready. One of the most powerful lessons from this journey is that true success is not just about achieving personal goals or climbing the ladder. It's about using your platform and abilities to make a meaningful difference in the world. Ellie's story teaches us that no matter where we start, our potential to create change is limitless when we have the courage to pursue it. The foundation they built together symbolizes the idea that success isn't just measured by titles or wealth, but by the impact we have on others. It reminds us that with determination, resilience, and a willingness to take risks, we can rise above challenges and create a legacy that lasts. In life, it's easy to get caught up in the pursuit of external validation, but true fulfillment comes when we align our actions with our values and work towards something bigger than ourselves. As we grow older and wiser, it's crucial to reflect on what truly matters and take the steps necessary to make a positive impact, whether that's in our careers, relationships, or communities. Don't be afraid to leap into the unknown. It's often where the greatest transformations happen. And so, as the lights dimmed on the story of this millionaire's journey, we realize that success isn't always a straight line. It's full of ups and downs, of moments when you feel like giving up, and others when everything seems to fall into place. But through it all, what truly matters is the courage to keep moving forward, to keep believing that tomorrow will be better. No matter where you are right now, no matter how difficult it may seem, remember that every step you take is one closer to the life you dream of. You're never alone on this path. You are capable, and the best is yet to come. Thank you for joining me on this journey today. If this story touched your heart, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone who might need a little encouragement today. Also, I'd love to know, where are you watching from, and what time is it in your part of the world? Drop your location and time in the comments below. Take a deep breath, feel the peace of the moment, and know that you are exactly where you need to be.